There is no such thing as a server function in the web platform itself. There's just fetch, right? And all it's doing is doing what we call syntactic sugar.
Hi, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. I'm Paige Niederinghaus, and today we have Jack Herrington, podcaster, software engineer, writer, and YouTuber, here to talk about how server functions don't really exist. In this episode, Jack and I talk about what server functions actually are. They're not a new web standard. When to use server functions for an app versus GraphQL or gRPC, and some of the best frameworks to get started with server functions today. So here's our episode with Jack Herrington. Welcome, Jack.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Glad to have you. So you recently did a video on YouTube about how server functions don't exist and it matters. It is something that developers should understand. So let's just talk a little bit about what you mean by that, because it may be a little bit confusing for developers who haven't necessarily heard that before.
Yeah, sure. So a bunch of frameworks have come out with this concept of server functions. So the idea, and then we'll add let's say Next.js, Waku, now Remix, and TanStack Start, both on React and Solid, Quick, and then Solid Start. There's a lot of these, right? But what they are is really you set up a function in your code, right? And you have some sort of way of hinting to the framework that this is a server function. So in the case of TanStack Start, there's an actual thing as a create server function. And then on Next is an example, you put in the use server directive. And what happens is when the framework compiles your code, it's creating two different bundles. And one bundle is for the server and one bundle is for the client. And so it takes the code that's in that server function and puts that into the server bundle and then attaches it to an API endpoint in some way or fashion. And then it builds into the client code, essentially just a function. And that function calls fetch and hits that API endpoint. So really, there is no such thing as a server function in the web platform itself. It's just there's just fetch, right? And all it's doing is what we call syntactic sugar, meaning that it's essentially just giving you a really easy way to do what is kind of a little bit more of a pain in the butt, right? So if you want to do this, build a DIY, right? You're going to have to create that API endpoint, put your server code in there, and then you probably want to go and build out, a module that has like an API call function in it. It's going to call fetch. And then if you're using TypeScript, you got to make sure that the types all align and that sort of stuff. You can use gRPC for that. You can use GraphQL for that. But it's a nice way of saving time if you're willing to put up with some of the things that you don't get to control. So you lose a modicum of control, but you get huge win for convenience.
So in your opinion, is blurring that line between kind of the front end and the back end, is it simplifying development, or do you think it's just hiding the complexity in new places?
Yeah, I think it definitely simplifies development, but you're correct in that it is hiding that fetch logic from you. And it's also having to do that magic to extract that server code. And that can be tricky to get right. Sometimes you get this leaking. And because there's a reason that you're putting stuff on the server, and oftentimes you got credentials in there, you're hitting other backend services and stuff like that. So you really don't want that leaking of that. So yeah, certainly a simplification, but there's some risks as well.
Yeah, I remember when server functions first came out, that was a thing that a lot of people were concerned about, is those API tokens and the environment variables where they hide secrets. Is that stuff accidentally being shared to the client and things like that? So still something that you have to deal with, or at least think about and be aware of.
And are people doing the right? Well, in general, you probably have to do authentication, right? You have to know who you are when the server function gets called, so you can make whatever database calls are correct for that user or whatever. But have you also checked for authorization in those server calls? Maybe, maybe not. So I think, there's that issue as well, because you're creating API endpoints.
So you said that the web platform really doesn't understand what server functions are. They're not really a thing. The browser doesn't know what they are. It doesn't care. Do you think that it should evolve to somehow support those more natively, or should it stay out of it and just let the framework authors handle it if they want to?
That's a really good question. I certainly think right now we don't know enough about how these are going to be used at scale. All of the frameworks that these are on are not the most common frameworks. Like the Pages router for Next doesn't support them, but the app router does, except that most Next apps aren't on the app router. And similar sort of thing with Waku, like not a lot of folks are using that. Remix, it would have to be like the new RSC build of Remix that nobody's using yet. TanStack Start. So these are all like super cutting edge things. And we don't really know how at prod and at scale these things are going to work. Although the fact that they are just fetch calls gives us a strong sense of, oh yeah, we know that's going to work. I'm not sure what we get out of making that abstraction. It feels to me almost like web components. It's like, oh, those are a cool idea. Maybe it was a little bit too little, a little bit too late with those.
It's not catching on, I think, as much as some other previous improvements like hooks, for example, with React. It's just not reaching the critical mass as quickly. So let's say that you were building a new application from scratch today. How would you decide whether to use server functions or traditional APIs or even something like GraphQL or TRPC?
Yeah, so I put this in the video kind of at the end, which is, so now we've talked about what server functions are and how they work, and I show a couple examples about how all the data comes in and out. It's like, exactly, what should you use it or not, right? And I think it really boils down to, is this an external API or an internal API? Like, are there going to be other customers for this? Are your customers going to be calling this API? Do they expect to have, they're going to be writing clients on top of it? Or do you have mobile developers and are they going to be writing their application on top of it? And if you're going to be doing that, well, yeah, you probably want to have a controlled API. Standards compliant would be even better. If you're going to be using like REST plus some endpoints, then use OpenAPI or use GraphQL or TRPC, something that you can actually have clients for. And those clients could be maybe something other than JavaScript, like Kotlin or Swift or whatever. If you don't have that, really an internal facing app, I think, is where these are really going to start off. If you've got like your admin site for your .com or whatever, or your CMS site or something like that, right? This is perfect for that because then you can just really just crank. You can just be like, oh, okay, this thing that needs to have on the server, cool, order function, go, bang, done. That kind of thing. Even if it leaks creds, who cares? But,
Right.
not really.
Doesn't matter. It's internal.
It's internal.
Fine.
Yeah.
So if you were going to say it, do you think that writing server functions like regular functions improves the productivity, or does it just make debugging harder when you're trying to figure out what is going wrong with my API function?
I do think it makes it a lot easier. And I really haven't run into a case yet where there's been any issues calling like the mechanics of the server function. And it's so easy, right? It's just a fetch, right? And so you just have to like mess up fetch somehow. And things like the cookies and all that, they naturally go along with the fetch anyway. In general, I haven't seen any issues with that. Maybe there'd be an issue where people don't know that they're calling a server function, but a thing that actually gets executed on the server, and maybe they're worried about being offline or something like that. But I guess you can probably run into that anyway in a highly like abstracted system where you make some data change somewhere in 5 levels of abstraction deeper, it actually goes off and fires something to the server. You never know.
In the video that you said, you had like a nice little chart of benefits for using server functions versus a standard GraphQL or API JSON endpoint. But one of the things that you talked about or that you mentioned about server functions is that you do lose control over things like the URLs. You don't necessarily get to say this is a get or this is a post. Your data formats can get a little wonky when you look at the responses that are coming back. That was a big one. So do you think that this is a fair trade-off for the simplicity that server functions do offer to developers in general?
Yeah, I think I guess we're calling BFFs, right? So that's like the back end for front end. You have some UI, it needs to have stuff from the server. You don't really care necessarily about how it gets it. The two big ones are the control over the URL and the control over the method. If it's not a get, you've got issues with caching. It's going to break out your CDN. It's going to break your web cache or your browser caching. So you're losing a lot there. And Next.js, Waku, all the kind of core React ones, and also Quick and Solid Start, they don't allow you to control the verb, right? You can't say that this has to be a post or a get. TanStack Start, on the other hand, actually does allow you to say, this is going to be a get and this is going to be a post. And then that gets really cool So you can actually control that. In all cases, you don't get to control the URL. That can be a little issue too. I think with Next and Waku, they literally just like it's a post to slash. And then it's the middleware on slash that's like, oh, okay, this is a server function or whatever. And so you're kind of looking at like your URLs and you're like your network tab, and you're like, that's kind of interesting. Whereas TanStack actually, wherever the module was that actually created the server function, that's part of the URL. So you can actually see it.
Going along those same lines, how do you think that they stack up server functions when it comes to things like monitoring, observability, caching, especially when the apps start to get larger and more complicated?
Yeah, observability is definitely a problem, right? If everything's going on to slash and everything's hidden behind in a post, that a lot of observability tools are going to be like, I don't know what you're talking about there, that kind of thing. And so you're going to end up adding like observability code manually into the server function to say, oh, I got called. Here are my parameters and whatnot. It's a little bit better with TanStack Start. But if this is a big deal for you, I think probably want to go back to API routes. Yeah. And maybe even have like microservices that you connect to with cores or however you want to route it and all that in a different application.
Yeah. And I've been in that very situation where even though we have API calls like in a Next.js application or server functions, we still have an Express.js app that's just running in a backend being an API server for everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it doesn't really, not necessarily saving you any amount of code or any amount of microservices in the end.
Again, if you're just trying to get some data to the client, then this is probably okay if it's an internal app or something like that. Actually, this is a kind of nice hybrid scenario here where you have your more formal APIs. Those are often a microservice, they're on its own thing, and they're deployed separately and all that. And then if you've got like little validation things or something like that, those could be decent functions. So an example of this is, let's say that I'm like a cable company. And part of my form for the customer is, hey, give us your address or give us your zip code, and we'll tell you if we service your area for cable or whatever. And that's a great little server function because all you're doing, you don't want to put everything out on the client. You don't want to have like tons and tons, every address conceivable on the client. You want to go off and make the call. So that server function could then go off and hit a database or whatever it needs to go and get really quickly that lookup on that. But I think it's a really nice thing for that. Although, again, getting that get post thing, you do want to even in that case probably have a get so that the first person that says 19081 is my zip code or whatever, it goes and caches that on the CDN and you know.
So if server functions are making it easier for us to write full stack apps faster and more quickly, do you think that we risk making the architecture a little bit more brittle and harder to change or to scale later on?
So that's a tough one to answer because server functions allow for this unique ability to like modularize code in a way that like API routes don't. When RSCs first came out, they came out with this idea of a Lego RSC. And the idea is that you have your React UI code. Imagine you're building like an auth library, right? And so you have components for things like sign in, sign up, sign out, all that sort of stuff. And the nice thing about server functions is you can literally package the server functions that would help build those and talk to the back end with the components themselves. And so you can literally just drop onto the page, hey, here's my sign in button. And yes, it has to make a call to the back end. That's a server function. It gets deployed. It gets wrapped up in that and goes. It's really convenient. But when you think about not doing that, if you want to have an API route, now you've got to probably have two different libraries. You got your library for your components, is just a React library. And then you got another library that's got your like Hano or Express endpoints and all that. And those have to be merged in. And then as part of your setup for the components, you got to tell it where did I mount those API endpoints. And it just gets like kind of a hassle. So I think in a way that's almost more brittle, like the API side of the house there. But I think that the server functions do allow for that really unique modularization. Yeah.
That's a great answer. Do you see server functions eventually becoming part of a broader standard like HTTP, or do you think that they'll always be tied to the specific frameworks that they're within?
Yeah, again, I think we have to wait to see like when they're actually like rolled out at scale. Like when some of these frameworks that we're talking about right now get wide usage. And probably the two that are your biggest contenders there be Next.js's app router, could get really big. TanStack Start probably has the ability to get like really big, the next pages router. Once that actually happens and we start seeing server functions at scale, then I think we'll get some hint as to whether we want to kind of create like a new verb or whatever. I don't know. I got to say, I don't see it. I think what we got right now with HTTP is fine. And these server function standards can do all kinds of cool stuff. Like you can send back a streaming response. You can do all kinds of stuff with them. That's all just based on HTTP. So if we added a whole new thing, then we have to add a whole new like monitoring and all that stuff. I don't know. And do we need that? I don't think so.
What do you think that server functions will look like in 5 years' time? Any predictions?
I think they'll make a huge dent in the internal application space. Beyond that, yeah, I don't know. I think for like small use cases, small BFFs, sure, they'll make some inroads there. But I think there's still a huge value for things like GraphQL, TRPC, OpenAPI, all of that stuff, because we got great tooling around that. And this is just, again, like syntactic sugar. It's not going to write everything in it, but it's going to make some things a lot easier.
A question that a lot of people ask about anything once syntactic sugar starts to become part of the standard way of using a language or a framework. Do you think that developers are going to start losing important knowledge about how web requests and data flow actually work if they don't have to write it themselves?
That's a good one. I don't think it's going to be as hidden as, let's just say, a lot of JavaScript engineers didn't go through like C and C++ or Java or any of those, so they never had to deal with memory management. As a result, like they don't really know references and kind of the core mechanics there. Where with this, you're still making network requests. You can still see them in the network panel. So I don't think it doesn't hide it as much. You're still going to have some sense of the data flow and all that. But yeah, maybe if all you do is just use server functions, then yeah, you might lose some knowledge of how to do like anything else, like GraphQL or simple API endpoint calls.
What would have to go wrong today, in your opinion, for us to look back and say, wow, server functions were really a mistake that we should not have done?
I think big security vulnerabilities making it out into the wild, right?
Yeah.
That would really put a huge dent in it. Yeah, other than that, kind of misuse in terms of like people not knowing that these are posts, breaking caching a lot. Yeah, but there's such cool possibilities when you use things like this. One of the neat things that you can do with Next.js and Remix and Waku is you can return an RSC of a server function. So you can return a React server component out of a server function. That gives you the ability to like have a server-driven UI. And so that's a unique win there that you don't get on the API side currently, although that's really just a limitation of the framework. So yeah, there's really good upsides, a few downsides, but I just don't see anything necessarily that's going to be like, oh yeah, this blew up and now nobody ever wants to use server functions ever again.
So if people wanted to learn more about server functions and get started with it, let's say they haven't really dipped their toes into it yet, what would be your recommendations for the best frameworks to try or places to go online to get started with that?
Yeah, I would try out TanStack Start because I think that actually gives you the most control that you'll want to see over server functions. They have to define whether you want to get or a post, and I think that's a good thing. They also allow you to do middleware as well as data validation. The most convenient one would be to use like App Router because it's got support for it right out of the box and has the most documentation around it.
Yeah. Is there anything that we haven't talked about yet that you wanted to mention from your article or from your video that people should know?
No, I think we covered quite a lot of it, actually. It made me think a lot more about that. What I wanted to do with that video is really demystify this. And I have actually had people ask me questions about server functions that betray the fact that they think that this is some sort of like new core mechanic to the web.
Yeah.
And when it's really just a little bit of helper around building an API function. And think about it, TRPC gives you the same thing. Once you get TRPC set up, all you got to do is just say, hey, cool, here's a function, route to that. Then you automatically get some client code. It just works. Type safety works and all of that kind of stuff works. This is just that convenience of TRPC built into the actual framework itself.
All right, so let's go into the quick round and wrap this up. These are short, snappy answers. So, what's one thing that still sucks about server functions?
Primarily just being restricted to a post And one thing actually we didn't talk about, which was sequential execution. So like on Next.js or Waku or Remix, when you invoke one of these server functions, it will not invoke the next server function until the first server function actually releases, which is a big deal.
That is, waterfall is not the best.
No, yeah.
What's one framework that's nailing server functions?
TanStack Start, either in its solid or its React form.
What is the next big abstraction after server functions?
I'd say probably image asset management. So Next.js has a really good abstraction around that. Also, font handling, because there's some issues around that. These are just common pain points for us as front end developers that we really don't have any good fixes for. And yeah, I'd say image management is a big one.
Jack, it has been great having you on the podcast today. If people want to get in touch with you, learn more, talk about server functions, where are the best places to find you online?
Sure. You can head over to my YouTube channel, Blue Collar Coder. That's my name, actually, Jack Herrington. You can hit me up on Twitter. But also, I'm on a podcast called the Front End Fire Podcast with TJ Van Tol and Paige Niederinghaus. So we release every week, and you can get all the news about front end development there. We have a really great time. So yeah, come and join us there.
Cool. Thank you for joining us today. It has been great having you on the PodRocket podcast.
Yeah, great being here, Paige.